Every criminal case leaves behind some kind of evidence, but a true mystery, well, that leaves behind lingering questions. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're stepping back into the smoky, shadowy streets of the late 1970s and early 1980s to examine a case that fundamentally altered the landscape of criminal investigations. We're looking at a story built out of flashing police lights, classified FBI case files, and detective silhouettes working long into the night. It's a case known as the Atlanta Child Murders, and it's a profound example of how forensic science, community resilience, and just an absolutely massive manhunt intersected in unprecedented ways. There's a saying, some crimes change a city forever, while others leave questions that continue for decades. And honestly, that perfectly captures the gravity of what we're about to explore. Between 1979 and 1981, a profound darkness fell over Atlanta, Georgia. An unthinkable reality set in as children and young adults began disappearing, one after another, seemingly without a trace. It was a crisis that not only demanded the largest response in FBI history, but also ultimately led to the arrest of one man. Yet, even today, looking back through the lens of history, a lot of people still question whether the complete truth has ever really been dragged out into the light.
Okay, let's dive right into this with part one, The Nightmare Begins.
It all starts with the first known victim, 14-year-old Edward Hope Smith. On July 28, 1979, Edward and another teenager, Alfred Evans, vanished while simply walking to a local store. It was just a mundane, everyday activity that ended in absolute tragedy. 2 days later, both boys were found dead. Now, at first, investigators looking at the case files initially believed these murders were entirely unrelated. But as we move forward in time, more and more children disappeared. By 1981, the scattered pins on the map began to connect, and authorities realized, with a growing sense of dread, that they were dealing with a terrifying, escalating pattern.
That brings us to part two, a city in paralyzing fear.
Over the next 2 years, the unimaginable became a daily reality. Numerous, mostly African-American children, teenagers, and several young adults were found murdered all around the city. Many victims had been strangled, while others were discovered discarded in wooded areas or local rivers. And the atmosphere in Atlanta? It completely transformed into this daily, suffocating fear. Parents entirely stopped letting their children play outside. Literally, something as simple as a school routine was drastically altered to ensure kids were never, ever walking alone. Whole neighborhoods, living under this constant threat, formed community patrols, walking the dark streets just to protect their own. And as the victim count kept rising, the glaring spotlight of the national media turned its heavy focus squarely onto Atlanta, just watching and waiting. That intense pressure demanded a massive response. Thousands. That represents the sheer volume of interviews conducted as the FBI officially joined local police. They teamed up to launch what would become one of the most extensive and complex homicide investigations in American history. Detectives and federal agents were working around the clock, compiling massive dossiers, analyzing hair samples, dusting fingerprints, tracking vehicles, and chasing witness statements, searching for absolutely any possible lead. But despite those thousands of interviews, the investigation felt a lot like walking through a dense fog. Police set up massive roadblocks. They deployed surveillance teams to sit in the darkness, monitoring the bridges and rivers where victims had previously been discovered. Yet, for all this immense coordinated effort, investigators just continually hit dead ends. They struggled to identify a viable suspect, and the tension in the city continued to mount to a breaking point. Let's look at part 3, the River Splash Breakthrough. Now, what's really interesting here is the question, what caused the loud splash in the Chattahoochee River? This is the exact puzzle surveillance officers had to solve in the dead of night. While staking out a bridge over the river in the early morning hours of May 1981, officers suddenly heard a distinct, loud splash in the dark water below. Moments later, they stopped a station wagon driving away from the scene. Behind the wheel was a 23-year-old music promoter named Wayne Bertram Williams. At the time of the stop, the officers didn't actually have enough to hold him, so Williams was initially released. But the investigative machinery immediately kicked into high gear, pulling background files and examining his life. Then, days later, the grim confirmation arrived. Another victim's body was discovered downstream from that exact bridge. The timing of the splash, the location, and Williams' presence raised intense, inescapable suspicion. Suddenly, the entire weight of the task force was focused squarely on him. Moving into Part 4, the Forensic Evidence Web.
So the crucial point is that without a murder weapon or a direct eyewitness to the crimes, investigators had to build a forensic web to connect their suspect to the victims. Imagine a sprawling evidence board totally connected with red string. They relied heavily on the emerging science of the era. Investigators meticulously compared fibers collected from several victims. According to prosecutors, microscopic fibers found on the victims' bodies perfectly matched the carpeting in Wayne Williams' home and the interior of his station wagon. Furthermore, dog hair recovered from the victims was also matched to Williams' own dog. Combined with detailed witness statements and deep background examinations, prosecutors built a highly technical case. Even without anyone directly observing the murders, they argued this combined forensic puzzle strongly, undeniably linked Williams to multiple victims.
In 1982, the case finally moved into the courtroom, where some starkly drawn battle lines were established. Wayne Williams was officially charged with the murders of two adult victims, Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. The prosecution leaned heavily into that circumstantial evidence we just talked about, the fibers, the dog hair, the timeline. On the flip side, the defense fought back fiercely, arguing the evidence was entirely insufficient and challenging the reliability of the state's forensic conclusions altogether. Throughout it all, Williams maintained his innocence. But after weeks of grueling, highly technical testimony, the jury returned a guilty verdict, and Williams was sentenced to life in prison.
Finally, Part 5, A Legacy of Questions. And this brilliantly illustrates how the lack of absolute closure continues to fuel debate today. While authorities officially closed many of the child murder files by attributing them to Williams, he was never formally tried for those specific murders, and not everyone accepted the narrative. To this day, some families firmly believe that multiple killers may have been operating in Atlanta during those dark years. There were persistent questions over whether investigators correctly linked every single victim to one man. Wayne Williams himself has consistently maintained his innocence from behind bars for decades. And in recent years, the push for answers has even led authorities to pull those old files out of the archives, re-examining parts of the evidence using modern DNA technology that simply didn't exist back in 1981.
Regardless of the ongoing debate, the historical impact of this case is absolutely undeniable. The Atlanta child murders forever changed how law enforcement operates in the United States. It catapulted forensic science, specifically microscopic fiber analysis, into the national spotlight, proving that seemingly invisible threads could actually build a massive case. It also set a totally new standard for cooperation, showing how local police and federal investigators could seamlessly integrate their intelligence to track a killer across jurisdictional lines.
More than 4 decades have passed since this wave of terror shocked Atlanta. Wayne Williams remains imprisoned, yet the lasting scars on the community and the families of the victims, those haven't faded. As investigators, journalists, and historians continue to pore over the case files looking for missing pieces in the dark, the debate burns on. We have to ask ourselves, when a city's wounds run this deep and the shadows of the past refuse to dissipate, will we ever know for certain if every answer has truly been found?